Hi everyone, this is a lecture on Komawari, which is the art of dividing panels in manga. So we talked about the storytelling structure, Kisho Tenketsu. We did our Yonkoma manga. Now we're going to take that story using the Kisho Tenketsu structure and turn it into a proper 1 to 2 page manga using Komawari. Before we start that, I want to just go over some basic terminology in 2D design, some fundamentals. So we'll start with picture plane. Picture plane is the flat surface of the page where all visual elements exist. In comics and manga, each one of your panels is its own picture plane. So when we're thinking about composition, not only are we thinking about the page overall, but we're also thinking about the compositions in each one of the panels and how they look together. Balance, very important term. Visual balance is the intuitive optical equilibrium between parts of a composition. Visual balance can't be measured, and it's a component that is felt. Each figure in a composition has a certain visual weight. So bright colors typically appear lighter in weight than dark colors, black, of course, being the heaviest. There's also symmetrical balance versus asymmetrical balance. Asymmetrical balance occurs when elements are not mirrored across an axis within the composition, and it tends to be interpreted as more dynamic than symmetrical balance, right? Symmetrical means everything looks exactly the same on both sides. Um, if the drawing is good, but something feels off, it could be the balance is off. You can try rotating things in your design or moving the camera, playing with the depth so you can play with the size of different elements in your panel so you can achieve the best balance. Here are some examples of asymmetrical compositions in art that you probably recognize. A balanced composition helps everything in your picture plane feel like it should be there. It makes it feel complete. I think about asymmetrical balance a lot when I design panels as well. And overall in pages, you're thinking about the abstract arrangement of elements. If you remove what the content is and what it means, can you achieve a sense of balance? Visual weight. It's the visual heaviness of an element based on size, density, or contrast. It's kind of difficult to explain some of these things exactly. You just kind of feel it. Heavy panels can anchor the page, and light panels move the reader quickly. This is determined the weight is determined by things like size, complexity, color, or contrast. So black is heavy, and things at the bottom of the page naturally feel heavier. So if you want to balance out a composition that, like in this example, has a lot of detail work up top, you could try putting black or large objects on the opposite end of your complex objects to try and balance that out. Focal point is another important term in design. It's pretty self-explanatory. And there are some strategies to make people look at the focal point. One is contrast. Specifically in manga traditionally, which is black and white, black-white balance is very important. Right? High contrast equals impact. Low contrast is subtlety or calm. You don't always want high contrast. Just because it's interesting and engaging doesn't mean you should overuse it. A lot of assignment submissions that I get look more like the line art on the left than completed pieces. Sometimes just adding black can complete your design. Of course, how you apply the black depends on what kind of mood you want to set. It's a very specific, almost noir, film noir mood that we have on the right. I'm not saying you have to do that, but getting your work to a level of completion by not being afraid to use black is something that I advise. It's something I try to incorporate in my art, and I found that using a lot of black can help the design feel resolved and complete. So don't be afraid to use black when we're working in a black and white medium. This is an artist I wanted to introduce that I really like, Frank Miller, who did Sin City, 300, The Dark Knight. He uses black-white balance very well. Really strong contrast with actually without too much line work. It's just enough. I recommend looking up Frank Miller if you want some inspiration for the courage to lean into your black. Okay, now Komawari. Let's talk about the basics of the art of dividing panels. So first, panel layout. What that is the process of deciding the shape, size, and placement of the panels within a manga page. This is the foundation for smoothly conveying your story to the reader. You always want to think about laying out your panel as design. You want to think about design, elements, balance, the overall composition. It's not just boxes to put pretty pictures in. The panels are an active part of the artwork. Panel layout has two roles: navigation, which is navigation, and enshutsu, direction, like directing, like film director. Um, navigation naturally guides the reader's gaze, and directing conveys the passage of time and the story and the emotions of the characters. So this allows the reader to intuitively understand the flow of the story and the psychology of the characters. Panel layout technique is an essential element that determines the quality of your manga. Manga panels are like windows into the story. Meanwhile, the gaps between the panels, which are called the gutters, refer to the white space between the panels, or black, depending on what kind of comic you're drawing. By adjusting the width of the gutter, you can make the reader feel the passage of time. For example, a wider gutter gives the impression of a scene change or a jump in time, while a narrower gutter can express a short period of time or continuous movement. That being said, it is important to establish some sort of standard in your comic, so you usually don't want to have more than two different gutter sizes. And how you adjust the space between these frames. The basic rule is to leave a wide gap between the top and bottom rows, and a narrow gap between the left and right rows. This takes advantage of the fact that the eye tends to flow towards narrower gaps, so the eye flows from right to left. However, when changing scenes, make sure to leave plenty of space between those scenes, regardless of whether you're changing up, down, left, or right, just to help us feel that transition better. Now, a brief word from Scott McCloud, who did a really outstanding book called Understanding Comics from '93. This is about intentionally omitting the gutter, which is something that is particularly used in Japanese manga. So I'm going to start from reading in the second panel. Time is no longer contained by the familiar icon of the closed panel, but instead hemorrhages and escapes into timeless space. Look at that. Such images can set the mood or a sense of place for whole scenes through their lingering, timeless presence. Once again, this is a technique used most often in Japan and only recently adopted here in the West. He's talking about letting the panel extend all the way to the end of the page and not being contained inside of a box. Moving on. So the basic rules for panel layout. The basic reading style in Japanese is top to bottom, right to left. And you can liken the flow of moving through the panels to the letter Z. So by arranging the panels with the Z movement in mind, readers can follow naturally without getting lost. It's very, very important for your work to be readable and easily understood. The key to making manga appealing is to create contrast by placing large, what's called misegoma, or like show frames. Mise means to look. So like the frame that you want to show in Koma's panel. Use a misegoma to highlight important scenes and make the other frames smaller. By achieving good balance between large and small panels, a rhythm is created throughout the page, making it clear to the reader which scenes they should pay attention to. It's always important to have a misegoma. Usually on every page, definitely on every double page spread. There should be something where you're like, look at this. This is what I want to show. In design, this is a principle called dominance and subordination. There should always be a sense of dominance and subordination, whether something is in front of something or larger or some kind of contrast makes you focus on it, the focal point. Sometimes you need to design a panel in a way that helps communicate what's actually happening in the artwork, right? So if you remember the Manga no Manga book, chapter 1 lecture, if you want to draw a really tall mountain, it should probably be in a vertical panel, right? Or if you want to show the distance that a really fast car drove, a horizontal panel would be more conducive to showing that. It is important to note that if you do a bunch of irregular panels or diagonals, it can be overwhelming to the reader. So keep that in mind. So in the center panel here, I adjusted the shape to follow the movement of the action to give us an increased sense of depth. This is just an example how the panel is an active part of the artwork. It's not just a box you put the artwork in. You can use the panel to help you shape the story and what's happening. How you decide on a misegoma, a showpiece. So when you're making a scene, you're going to think about what's the most impactful moment on the page and put that panel in a large area, make it big. And by focusing on this highly visible frame, the overall composition of the page will come together and the placement of the other frames will become smoother. So think about what's big first. Don't always think chronologically when you're putting a comic together, when you're putting a manga together. It's not always about drawing things or creating things chronologically. Think about the experience of the reader first. So the misegoma, since that's the highlight and that takes over the page, think about placing that first. Once you've decided the misegoma, you can place the other frames in the remaining space. And don't forget to use the Z guide for your reader's gaze and to adjust the balance to make sure you have a natural reading flow. There should always be a panel on the page that you want to show your reader the most. And this should be the largest panel. And there's a lot of things I'm doing here to make it the focal point. Characters front and center. The panel is the largest. The character is popping out of the frames. I'm using these radial lines, adjusted speed lines to point directly at the character. There's a lot of things telling the reader, look at this. Oh my God, look at this. Right? A misegoma. A panel that you want to show. There should always be a sense of dominance and subordination in your designs. All right, so moving on to the 9 grid pattern. It generally is good to think of a manga page as divided into a 9 grid pattern, 3 columns and 3 rows. Sometimes that's 4, usually not more than that. It's your job within this grid pattern to determine the design of your layout, right? Selecting which areas to make larger or smaller, what to move horizontally, vertically. I like to think of designing panels for me as negotiating space. So I start with this, and then I can start negotiating the space and stretching and pulling and shrinking and moving things to still fit within that modular framework. There's an infinite number of variations within this framework. Let's talk about some common mistakes and some tips to keep in mind. If your panel arrangement or word bubbles are disorganized, the reader will be confused about where to read next. Follow the basic reading order rules and be mindful of smooth eye guidance. Try to avoid too many awkward breaks in the overall grid pattern. You see here on the left where we have all these breaks and empty space. Sure, if that corresponds to something you're doing in your story or you want some sort of confusion, or if it works for something experimental, that's fine. But generally, just looking at the panels on the left, it's not very good. They're underutilizing the space that they have. There's all these missing segments where something could be. It's better to have a modular design where everything is lined up. Another common mistake, not varying the size or shape of the panels. Everything looks the same. It's boring. Even if there's incredible, amazing artwork inside of the panels, you can totally ruin a piece or a page if the panel design is poor. This is an important one. There's something called the 180 rule. It can be really confusing for your reader if the position or direction of your characters change frequently during a scene. It's important to make sure that the position and direction of characters are consistent so that the reader does not get lost. Really keep that in mind when you're doing your directing. Remember, enshutsu, directing. You have control of the camera and you decide beforehand where people stand, where they sit, where they're set up. Putting the word bubble in an awkward position oftentimes tells that the artist didn't think about the word bubble placement before they came up with the overall composition, where the characters are, the background and such. Just like the panels are a part of the design, the speech bubbles are also a part of the layout and should not be an afterthought. Unless you want to cover up the person's face on purpose, it's just important when you're doing your thumbnails and when you're doing your name, to consider where the speech bubble is placed and what size it is before you start your final draft, so you can avoid this. Overlapping the panel, the frame. When you want to express the continuity of time or show multiple scenes progressing simultaneously, or to introduce a character, that's a often used tactic. Overlapping your panels can add a sense of realism, and if you can use it skillfully, it can create a really cinematic effect. It's something I like to do. I love overlapping. You don't want to do it too much. If you do it too often, then it no longer feels important. A note about page turns. You always want to think about how you can get the reader to turn to the next page. You can build up the reader's anticipation by including a hook at the end of the page that makes them want to know what happens next. And then using a turnaround at the beginning of the next page, for example, to create impact. So you have full control over these scenes that you're creating. You're deciding how you're dividing up these scenes into, really static, not moving panels. So sometimes you need to add or subtract so you can get the page turn at the proper time, right? So any kind of big reveal that you have, usually you want that to be at the beginning of the page. Here's an example of a panel I used at the end of a page. So where you're designing your scenes, it's good to think of where to place impact moments and how to build up to them. You can use the beginning of a page for shocking images, having built up to the moment on the page before, or put a major moment at the end of a page if you want your audience to linger and contemplate and sit with that page and sit with that scene. How do you want your reader to feel once they finish a scene, once they finish a page? That will determine how you set up the shots around the big payoff moment. Framing. Tight framing is for intensity when things are close. When there's a lot of visual tension, that's another design term. When things are very close, a lot of lines next to each other creates tension. Wide framing is for showing the environment or context, or for slowing a scene down. A beat panel, or tamino koma, is a panel that you use to emphasize. You can use these for timing and to set up unexpected moments or dramatic scenes. So it's just a panel right before the thing takes place. Instead of just immediately getting into the thing that happens or showing the thing, you can go off for a moment, or you can do a little pause. This is just controlling pacing. Sometimes you need a full page to say what you want to say. Um, you don't want to use these more than once or twice in a single chapter or one shot. So for your final project, for your one shot, one, maybe two, but it's better to just have one full page, or even a mihiraki, which is the double page spread. If you have too many of these, they become less important. Okay, next, just a few more notes about flow and interest and time. Story time first. So I studied under a manga professor at Kyoto Sekai University several years ago, Professor Akira Saso. Kyoto Seika is the only university with a whole manga department. It's the #1 research institute for manga in the world, and I just happened to get an opportunity to study under Professor Saso. And he gave me the storytelling textbook that you can see here on the left from the Seika manga department. They have a manga storytelling program, and I got their in-house textbook. And in that book, which I studied, it says that the two most important things to keep in mind when making manga are, one, omoshirosa, and two, yomiyasusa. Omoshirosa, like intrigue, interest. Yomiyasusa, the ease of reading, clarity. The two most important things to keep in mind when you're creating manga are, one, is it interesting? And two, is it clear and easy to understand? And I'm going to give you a bunch of tools and ideas to make sure that your work is visually interesting story-wise, and that it's clear. So the 9-grid pattern. Let's say I have a manga and I submit a manga like this. Think about the two most important things: interest and clarity, intrigue and clarity. It's clear. It's really easy to follow the flow. But the problem is this is incredibly boring, right? It's monotonous. This is not a good design. It works for clarity, but in terms of intrigue, interest, it fails. Um, so what makes it boring? Monotony, right? Monotony is the same thing over and over and over again. That's boring. And what's the opposite of monotony? Variety, diversity, right? Something different is what makes things interesting. Different size, different shape, things moving. Now this is better, but there's still a big problem. Right now we have some difference in panel size and shape, but now what's wrong? Clarity is gone. The reading order is really confusing here. So you always need to think about both. Now this is a better design, right? There's some diversity in size and shape of panels, and the reading order remains very clear with that zigzag pattern. So this is a panel layout that I would call successful. Something like this, no matter how beautiful the pictures are, how well rendered they are, how awesome and engaging the story is, this is going to flatten out your work. This is incredibly boring. You should not do a panel arrangement like this. Here's kind of what a progression looks like. A lot of times, some people like to work in steps and stages and start with a sketch. So you could start here on the left. Panels are all the same. And then we can change the size of the gutters. So we have some, some dominance and subordination. We have some things to focus on. Then varying the panel width gives some dynamics and helps getting rid of distractions. Finally, varying the width and the height. And you have the most diversity and the most interest. It's easy to understand, and the panels look different. Um, one more design thing I want to talk about is the difference between a static and a dynamic design as it relates to manga panels. So static is all about balance, symmetry, horizontals, consistency. Dynamism is energy, movement, tension, asymmetry. Let's look at it and look at some panels. So static compositions are about balance. It's good for dialogue scenes, intimate scenes, or establishing stability in your story, or for panels with complete silence, right? Sometimes static panels are very important if you want to slow things down. Dynamic panels, on the other hand, are great for communicating speed or excitement, to communicate energy and movement. Dynamic compositions use diagonal lines, right? So what makes something dynamic from the perspective of design is the use of diagonals, right? So if I want to draw a scene that has a lot of action, I want to use diagonal lines. It's that simple when I'm putting my panels together. And dynamic doesn't always mean better, right? If I'm just drawing a character walking down a quiet street or two people having a casual conversation and I use these panels, my reader is probably going to think like, why is this so intense, right? And they'll be pulled out of the story. You want to keep your reader in the story. So dynamism, using verticals, using diagonals. If you can look at the way I arrange the panels, it is conducive to telling action. It feels energetic. It feels like it's moving. Static versus dynamic, whichever type of composition you choose to use, depends on what serves the story and what you're trying to communicate. A few more. Um, so designing for manga is very simple. If something is important, draw it bigger. That's it. The one thing on a page that you want to show your audience the most important thing to look at, you put it in the biggest panel on the page. It's that simple. Something like, for example, this, which I just found online, it's large, it's overlapping other panels. It's screaming, look at me, right? Don't hide the important things. If it's important on the page, it should be in the biggest panel, right? Big important image is up top here. Big important image in the center. This is an interesting layout. It's a little confusing. So if you look at the bottom three panels, it's kind of difficult to tell what order that they're read in. But this isn't always bad. There is something that you could use this ambiguity for. There's something called aspect to aspect transitions between panels. This is a theory from Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. It's used a lot in manga. So aspect to aspect transitions means basically showing the exact same moment from different vantage points. It's a way to really slow down your scene and to bring your audience into the story, into the place. Manga is all about bringing you into the place. Um, so for example, we can imagine like a scene at a beach, right? One panel shows the sun, one shows somebody, sitting on the beach, one shows a wave. It doesn't really matter what order you read those panels in. As long as it's intentional, it's okay to do something like this as long as you're purposefully and intentionally communicating this ambiguity because you want to do aspect to aspect transitions. Otherwise, if there is a specific order for the panels to be read in, then this is not a good idea for design. One more. I found this online and I think it's terrible, which is why I put it in this video. Um, Clarity is important. It's it's not really clear what this artist is trying to convey just with the panels alone. Um, because there's dominance and subordination of focal point. So a way that you can make something stand out is you make it large. Very clearly, the panel at the bottom right is the biggest. But overlap is also a way to make us look at things. So the panel at the top and the middle, they're sort of competing for what the focal point is. There isn't much consistency in the size of the gutters. Usually you want to have just two sizes of gutters. And the space on the bottom left is underutilized. Sometimes there aren't gutters, but there's some inconsistency. So at the top left, we see those two panels, they don't share a gutter, but the rest do. This is just a really bad design. And the reason why it's bad, and I can speak objectively about it, is that it's very clear, based on the design principles that I highlighted earlier, that there wasn't any thought or intention put into the arrangement of these panels. Now this is another thing I just found on the internet. I don't know where the comic is from, but it's about the circle of life. So it's meant to be read, I guess, in a direction, but you can look around and examine, and the way it's arranged and the way that it's composed, the elements are composed, um, it's for your eyes to wander. Now this is intentional. Everything is about intentionality. So ambiguity is okay as long as that's what you planned and you want your audience to sit and look over the page. Everything's okay with intention. Our rhythm, the pacing created by panel sizing, spacing, and density. Large panels slow time, small panels speed it up. Rhythm is the heartbeat of manga storytelling. Another note on time. So this, I think this is pretty interesting. So what's going on in these two panels? They're moving left to right. It's a guy looking at a sandwich and then he eats it. Now, what if I told you, without changing the artwork at all, just by changing what the size and shape of one of the panels, I can make him look at this sandwich for longer. Check that out. In comics and manga, since we don't have access to the temporal dimension in the same way, right? It's not an animation, it's not a movie. We have to use space to represent time. Same image, different amount of time looking at the sandwich. This is essentially the magic of comics and manga paneling. The panel helps you tell the story. The panel, how tight or wide you choose to frame your image, can influence how the reader perceives what's happening and how long it takes. This is something I think about a lot when I want to create quiet moments and scenes. If you want your audience to linger, consider making the character smaller, consider using wide framing, consider using negative space. Okay, the assignment. So what I want you all to do for Komawari practice for this week is I want you to design 9 different panel layouts. And I want you to use B4 sized paper, whether it's traditional or digital, I don't care. I just want you to design some different layouts. 3 of them I want to be stable, static, right? Think horizontals. Basically, the best way to think about static is, do I feel like I can stand or sit on it and be safe? I want you to do 3 dynamic, compositions that are using diagonals that feel like energy, movement, and action. And then I want you to do 3 that are completely experimental. Just like make up the weirdest stuff you can think of. Try to make it interesting. Try to think about design in the way that I talked here. But 3 static compositions, 3 dynamic, and 3 experimental. I'll show you some examples from my work. So these are this is static compositions, dialogue, right? Slow pace, static compositions. These are dynamic compositions using diagonals to simulate movement. And here are a couple that break the panel border. Sometimes we do this to introduce a character, sometimes to highlight a specific emotion or state, sometimes when you just want to do something cool. Here's some more experimental designs. Just playing around with what you can do with paneling. I'm sure you all will come up with some really interesting stuff as well. So just to recap, your assignment is to draw 3 static layouts, 3 dynamic layouts, and 3 that are experimental.